Good afternoon. I'm just going to wait a minute or two while people filter into the room. So once again, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the Provider Alliance workshop on training, credentialing, and the Business Associate Program that offers some ARP funding through the Office of Developmental Programs. Just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. So this afternoon's session is being recorded. So if for any reason you get bounced off or you need, you want to follow up on anything, please send an email to information@provideralliance.org, and we'll make sure we can provide you a link to today's session, recorded session. In addition, we'll be posting some things to the chat. So if you need to download that, please be on the lookout for the files that'll come through the chat. And we will be using the Q&A as well as the chat function for communication today. So if you have any questions throughout the session, please put those questions in the question and answer, as well as you're free to send those via chat. So again, want to welcome everybody. And with that, I'll introduce Patrick D'Amico, who is the Executive Director of the Provider Alliance. Patrick.
Thank you, Craig. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So today's session is on the ARPA funding that is available for training, credentialing, and business associates programs. So we are going to walk through a few things on our agenda. We're going to do some background on the American Rescue Plan Act. We're then going to drill down into the various ODP initiatives, just to give some context to where these dollars are coming from. And then we will get into the ODP announcement 22031 as updated, which includes the application for these funds. So we will try to walk you through very briefly the requirements, the form itself. It is all very straightforward and simple. So we would like to leave a sufficient amount of time in this workshop for you to ask questions. So we will only take up as much time as we need to, as we feel is necessary to kind of provide the overview. And we'd really like to leave it up to you to ask questions. We'll ask your feedback on a couple of poll questions we have. And we'll try to guide through the process and make sure that we give you as much information as we can about this initiative. So our objectives in holding this session is really to make sure that everyone is aware of these available funds. And we really want to encourage all providers to apply for these funds. We next and possibly want to explore opportunities for collaboration. So to the extent that everyone on this call and members across TPA and elsewhere across the state are interested in adopting some sort of a common platform or sharing information in a useful way in terms of workforce development, that is really what these funds are intended for. So to the extent you have an interest in doing that, we'll kind of check in with you at the end of the session to see how you feel about that after you review some of the information. And we recognize that you probably have to give it some more consideration. If you have not yet applied, we'll make the assumption if you're here at the workshop that you perhaps have not yet applied for these funds. And we do want to remind everyone that the deadline to apply is June 30th. So by the end of this month, that is the deadline to apply for these funds. So with that, I'd like to go back and review a little bit about the American Rescue Plan Act, the PA spending plan, which was proposed last June of 2021. You may remember this came out from the federal government to all the states. All the states submitted plans based on an allocation awarded from federal funding to each of the states. So Pennsylvania submitted a plan in July, or put it out to for public review and comment in June, and then stakeholder community and everyone across the state had the opportunity to respond. So this plan was not just for ODP as a department. This is a statewide program funded by the federal government. So various other human services entities and other opportunities for the state to invest monies into the state based on the American Rescue Plan Act. So this came out in final form, I think finally approved after some questions back and forth between the federal government and the state. I think ultimately in early December, the plan was approved. So the state is required to provide quarterly updates to CMS in terms of the progress it is making on the plan. So this is from the most recent update. You can find this online on the DHS website. And I just wanted to flag the one piece of information here is we'll go through this. I'm going to give a little background on the initiatives and how much was allocated, but there was $200 million that was allocated for recruitment and retention money, one-time payments that providers were eligible to receive based simply on what they had spent in fiscal years 1920 or 2021. So in the April 2022 update, the state reported back to the federal government that they had spent $155 million in payments to 602 of the 1,000 eligible providers. So we learned of this early on from our dialogue with ODP, that there were simply not all the providers applying for the funds. And you can see a shortfall there of $45 million in terms of what the state had promised the provider community and what actually they paid out. So trying to learn from that, we want to make sure that we communicate as best as possible the availability of upcoming initiatives. So if I can backtrack a little bit to, I mentioned the date of December the 9th. So this is a date that after the state received final approval from the federal government, Kristen Ahrens, Deputy Secretary, had held a webinar. And on this webinar, she had gone through the various aspects of the plan. So you can see the funding priorities for the ARPA funds, to address staffing issues, shortages in quality, supporting individuals and families on the waiting list, increasing the access to use and use of technology, strengthening ODP's HCBS infrastructure, and serving more people in the community. Providing funding to address high staff vacancy and turnover rates, one-time funding for COVID-19 related staffing expenses, recruitment and retention of direct support professionals or supports coordinators, supplemental payments under Appendix K were issued, request form for one-time funds published 12/2/22, up to 5% of prior year revenue. And this is the $200 million allocation. So this all relates to the funding around that allocation. So the updating of fee schedule rates. So I'll remind everyone that it was really the ARPA initiative, and we pulled TPA membership on this at that time in terms of how would you like to see this funding be released to the provider community. So by a large margin, we know that providers wanted to see money put into fee schedule rates. This was ultimately done. So ODP had split between the fee schedule rates and the one-time supplemental funding going out as one-time payments, really for the recruitment and retention money. That's how approximately $400 million was issued. So this is the one slide that addressed back in December exactly what this initiative is all about. I don't think that the language has changed much. The dollar amount has changed. It was originally announced as $50,000 or 1% of provider revenue. As you may now know, that is now $100,000 or 1% of provider annual revenue, which is ever is greater. The time frame, March 1, 21 through March 31, 2024. Estimated total funding, $23 million. I have not heard of changes in terms of the allocation amount. We'll go through a little bit about the dollars. I think there may be a change in the time frame, but that will be addressed in the announcement as well. So on December the 9th of last year, TPA did put out an announcement. So I just wanted to reference this briefly. This really broke down everything that ODP indicated that they were going to put out in terms of initiatives. So the priority was fee schedule rates. Of course, most of you know that those were published initially January 1st as proposed. Those were later finalized in the month of February. So those are now the fee schedule rates, although we continue to advocate for additional funding for DSPs to be included in the upcoming budget. So the beginning of all of that was really the ARPA plan monies that were released to the state. So what I've highlighted here on this slide are really just the things I've already talked about. The fee schedule rate increase, the $200 million for recruitment and retention, and then today's workshop subject, which is the $23 million allocated for the staff training, credentialing, business associates program for employment. And you can reference any of these documents if you're interested on the DHS website or on the TPA website. So This is the ODP announcement 22-031. This was updated. Originally, this did include supports coordination unit. So if you are part of a supports coordination unit and you're on this webinar today, what ODP had essentially done was to take the technology money, and rather than have the initiatives identified within this particular ODP announcement, ODP believed that it was more appropriate to channel the money to SCs through the technology initiative for remote monitoring of individuals and those sorts of things. So there is a higher limit on the technology initiative for SC units versus providers for that reason. So this was an update. This is why you see that supports coordination organizations are not included within the scope of this particular initiative. And this is just the text from the announcement. So the bullet pointed areas are really the high level overview of what ODP states that these funds can be used for. There is really very little further detail on this. So if any of you here today have submitted a plan, have specific thoughts for a plan, we welcome you to kind of walk through what you're doing to share that with us. We think that would be useful in terms of having other members learn about it and perhaps sharing some information on how you determine the cost of your programs. So I also want to reflect upon the meeting that we had on May 27th. We did bring out from the National Alliance of Direct Support Professionals, Dan Hermrich and Desiree Laux-Bear, and they did go through the eBadge Academy for the National Alliance of DSPs. So they spent probably about 45 minutes going through the plan. You may be familiar with it. They have revamped it over recent years. This is one of the items that qualify in terms of provider use, spending, workforce development, training, and credentialing. So if you are interested in adopting this at your organization, this is something that you could use the funding for. Certainly, there's no limitation. You can use it for any of those other elements that were described in the announcement. I wanted to run through briefly a couple of the slides that NADSP reviewed for us on May 27th. So these are the competency areas of NADSP. You'll note that NADSP is not specifically noted in the ODP announcement. However, if you cross-reference the CMS core competencies, which clearly are referenced, NADSP illustrated which of the CMS core competencies they have adopted, which of course they're in alignment with home and community-based services that are funded by Medicaid. They want to make sure that anything that they offer and sponsor as a credentialing initiative or program is going to be consistent with CMS requirements and standards. So you can see that you would be covering that base through the NADSP program, and they certainly did emphasize that in their presentation. So Craig, I believe, has posted to the chat a link for the presentation itself. I would invite everybody who didn't have a chance to look at that to maybe go back through that presentation. I think we have a recording available too, Craig, so if somebody wants to listen to that segment of the meeting, you can listen to what they had to say about the NADSP eBadge Academy. I know they shared contact information. We're happy to get you connected if you have an interest in learning more about the NADSP credentialing program as well. So they communicated pricing also. So pricing is sort of based on volume. So this is another opportunity. We believe that if more members join in, obviously if you're a larger organization and you hit these pricing levels, that's something that NADSP will certainly honor and have this conversation with you about. I don't know if there's a collaborative on this program, what we might be able to accomplish with NADSP in terms of pricing, but I know that they would have the conversation with us. We certainly talked about whether this could be adopted as some type of initiative. If enough TPA members were already using eBadge Academy or interested in adopting that, we think there's an opportunity of leveraging that information and working together and perhaps doing it more efficiently, and then learning along the way in terms of what were the benefits and outcomes of implementing a credentialing program at your individual organization or collectively. So another thing that I wanted to point out in terms of thinking about an initiative and funding that initiative through ODP's ARPA money is that NADSP is a credentialing program. They emphasize that they are really not a training program. So they work with training partners. They have accredited training programs that they encourage their members to use. And it is all part of the process of having NADSPs receive badges at various levels under their credentialing program. I know that NADSP certainly encourages, I know some members and providers across the state and elsewhere that do use the badge program and do link it to compensation. So it's another opportunity, whether or not you're comfortable or feel prepared to do that, because to be clear, the state and ODP do not tie any compensation differences to credentialing levels at this point, but it is something that you are interested in doing. Again, it would be another opportunity to sort of explore those options and interact with other members about the possibilities of doing so. So I raised this on the training side because these would be potentially additional costs. There are subscriber costs for you to enroll in, say, the College of Direct Support, to use any of these training initiatives that are listed that are NADSP accredited, but you would want to include these costs in your budget and on your application for the initiative for the staff training and credentialing programs. So to go back to the announcement, I just want to cover the basics, and it really is a very basic announcement in its own right. So providers interested in applying will complete and submit the attached staff training credentialing application to Rick Smith directly by email. The applications will be accepted through June 30th, 2022. Funding may be requested up to 1% of ODP eligible service revenue for either fiscal year 1920 or fiscal year 2021, or $100,000, whichever is greater. So in effect, what this means is you're eligible for a minimum of $100,000 if your service revenues, by ODP's definition, are greater than $10 million. You're able to claim up to 1% of those service revenues in your application to fund this initiative. So approval, documentation, and payment. Again, it's a pretty simple process. I touched base with Rick Smith earlier this week just for a few clarifications and a bit of guidance. First of all, he confirms that it's really been somewhat of an underwhelming reception in terms of receipt of applications. So ODP absolutely has a lot of funding available to fund this initiative. They also very much want to see this money go out. This is money from the federal government that really needs to be distributed to Pennsylvania citizens and to ODP programs through the ODP initiatives that they have announced. So the process is basically submit an application, project plans. You will get paid based on demonstration of what you have spent. There are progress payments that you can request along the way as you spend money, and there's a completion payment. So that's all captured here. The one-time supplemental funding must be used prior to October 31 of 2023, so next year. So you have plenty of time to sort of implement a program, put something in place, test it out to see if it is going to be more effective on your workforce in terms of development, training. Does it move the dial and improve retention and vacancies in any way? So this is really what ODP is looking toward and why they made this investment in these funding opportunities and these initiatives. And it is fairly significant. So that is, again, why we want to highlight this opportunity for all of our members and really all providers across Pennsylvania. So this is the two-page application. So again, I think we have this posted in the chat, and we have the attachment, which the application is the attachment to the announcement. I think this is set up in a PDF format that you can just fill out the application after you open it and just populate these fields and then just send it to Rick Smith. Again, you can see there is not a lot of detail requested. We would recommend that you provide the detail that you're able. However, if you're just really learning about this for the first time and the deadline is 20 days away, I would encourage you to do a couple of things. Certainly identify the available funding that you believe you would qualify. Look at some initiatives at a high level and determine if there's anything that you have been considering along these lines that would qualify. And again, I think these definitions are very broad. And then I think with very broad strokes, start to draft up a completed form of this application so that you can flesh something out that would be able to be submitted. ODP is going to review these on a rolling basis as they come in. Now, being that the deadline is at the end of the month, we're hoping to create a rush of applications that ODP has to analyze. But I think you can feel confident that they're not paying you money up front. that you can make adaptations along the way if something were to occur. I think the most important thing to emphasize is that you do have to submit the applications by the end of this month for them to be considered. So everything is pretty much a quick walkthrough here. They're not asking for a lot of detailed information. You can see the line items that they want, again, not very detailed. And you can submit a narrative, what you hope to accomplish, a description of the model. For instance, if you did like the NADSP eBadge community, you could put that in. What were your outcomes? You could list those out. And we're certainly willing to work with individual members or groups of members who want to have that conversation about they're thinking about something. Would other providers be interested? We think it's an opportunity to really establish a community of providers that may be looking at some kind of common method to improve some outcomes, or at a very minimum, improve some training. So you can look at it that way if you choose as well. These are dollars that are available for you to provide training resources for your employees. So some general guidance, just again, we really want to make sure everybody is clear on the parameters and the available funding. Just determining the available funding for your organization. So this isn't always the way we would recommend that you take this type of an approach in terms of what's the budget in terms of how much money can you get. But in this case, your application has a cap. We would like everyone to be aware of what you're eligible for. And again, we want to make clear that you would be looking at what ODP refers to ODP eligible service revenue. So typically this means money that ODP paid you on fee schedule rates, or it could include something that they paid you from another revenue source other than a fee schedule line item. There are some other methods that ODP does distribute funding to the provider community, but it's basically their dollars paid to you. And if you submit something or you're unclear about that, first of all, we're here to help you try to determine what that is for your organization. Secondly, Rick Smith is going to have all this information. So if you miss the mark, if you are over by a certain amount of money, he will certainly tell you. This occurred with the recruitment and retention dollars, where people were asking for amounts both below and above what they were eligible to receive. So I think you don't have to worry about ODP gatekeeping the process in terms of did you ask for too much money? But I think it's a good starting point for you to figure out what is available to you. So based on just the simple math of 1% and how large your organization may be, just in terms of intellectual and disability and autism claims that you have in funding received from ODP, this is kind of just a little simple grid in terms of size of organization based on ODP revenue. So if you're up to 10 million in claims, the $100,000 is the cap. And as you proceed, 20 million, 30 million, 40 and 50, you can see the eligible amount available to you under this ARPA initiative. So again, given the amount of money they had originally allocated, it's unclear that they could fund 1,000 providers as they were prepared to do with $200 million allocated for recruitment and retention money. However, there were very few applications submitted at my last check. When I confirmed twice with Rick that this was the method, I know some members had questions about whether the hard cap was actually $100,000. Rick had indicated in both my conversations with him that it was the greater of, and you can do the calculation that is illustrated up on the screen. He did share he had a proposal in the several $100,000 request range. So that is essentially, I think, the overview of ARPA, this particular initiative, the relevant information from the ODP announcements, and the methodology we would sort of recommend that you go through in terms of determining your eligibility. So again, as we go to questions, I am going to ask Craig to open a poll. We are interested in knowing if you have an interest in the NADSP program. And if you're interested in applying for these funds, just generally speaking, of course, we're expecting that you have an interest in doing so. But if you are interested in NADSP, are you further interested in collaborating with other members or other providers? So I certainly don't want to put that out there as a limiting type of factor. We happen to work with NADSP as a partner. Joe Macbeth has come to our meetings. Joe works closely with the Institute on Community Integration out of the University of Minnesota, which is run by Dr. Amy Hewitt. We use a lot of Dr. Hewitt's research and things such as our advocacy. So they are already very good partners to TPA. And more to the point, we believe it's a good opportunity for us to perhaps do some more things across membership. This could perhaps, again, based on the interest of membership, be something that maybe that the HR work group would look at in terms of building some initiatives and some parameters around what would we like to see occur out of a training program, what would be the priorities in developing such a program that would hopefully work for multiple members, and then we could collect some data and do some analysis on that going forward during the course of the 15 months of this initiative. So I am going to stop there. Craig, I'll trust we've got the poll open. And at this point, I just want to open it up for any Q&A. Please raise your hand. Feel free to speak up at the webinar. I also want to thank and welcome anybody that's joined us today who's not a member. We certainly welcome you here. We welcome you to join TPA membership and learn more. So for any of you on the call today, please, if all of your questions are not answered after today's webinar, the recording will be available, but please reach out back to us in terms of questions you have. We don't want to see anybody who wants to submit or has an interest in this money miss the opportunity by missing the deadline. So we're more than happy to provide technical assistance to you as well to help get your application filed or answer any questions you may have. So Craig, with that, let me turn to you. And is there anything that we need to address in the Q&A or the chat?
Yes, so we're having a little technical issue with the poll. We'll get that resolved here in a few minutes, but we do have a couple of questions that have come in through chat. One is from Bill Shoppy. A few weeks ago, Kristen reported that only about 10% of providers had applied for the training funds. Have you received any indication of what ODP will do with any unspent funds and how ODP might divert them to for other uses? And do we know, well, we'll start with that one. Sure.
Yeah, ever since we were informed that there was $45 million remaining from the earlier initiative, and that was very early in the year that the $200 million was committed. And then along the way, we similarly learned that it was sort of being under applied for. So I don't have a firm answer, Bill. I have a firm answer that when I asked about the 45 million a few days ago, there was still no decision made on that. So I think being that there are a lot of moving parts right now with both fee schedule rates, there's a lot of open appeals, there is a lot of underspending in terms of these initiatives. I would tell you, I believe there is still some possibility there will be some change to rates as the budget gets approved. So sheer speculation on my part would be that they probably don't want to commit anything until they sort of see where all the initiatives land and perhaps see where the budget lands for the upcoming year once it's approved, hopefully before July 1st. With that said, one thing I have heard is that there is perhaps some money to be invested, and I don't think this is anything that ODP has not said in the past, but for things that were carved out of one-time money or even rates. So if you have an exception to a needs-based rate and you were being paid on an exception basis, in many instances, the new rates really don't account for that. So I know there are some dollars out there that ODP is aware of that they may allocate to some of those instances. I don't have a good sense of what kind of dollar volume we're talking about. I wouldn't think there would be close to the amount they have in reserve, for instance, on the first initiative. But the short answer to your question is no, they really have not at ODP indicated to us where else they might allocate that. And with what is a pretty big ticket item as of a couple of days ago, that was still an open question. I was told it was still being considered. And again, my guess is they're going to hold it open until they really know the outcome of everything, including investment in rates going into next year, and if they have any shortfalls on any of the other initiatives or anything else that was committed and paid out in rates this year. So again, as you know, if you're waiting on retro payments, we hope we have some information for you by next week. So I think that's in the mix too, in terms of what was actually paid out in retro payments. That should mirror what we've been told in terms of the excess remaining from the 45 million, but there are just some things there yet to be sorted through. So we do not have an answer at this time.
Okay, and then there was a follow-up as to if any of this money may be used for the enhanced rates for CPS, and maybe that's extended to mid-January, or if they'll use it for other initiatives to help support staffing. Sounds like we just don't have any answers on that yet.
No, we don't have answers on that. I think that the enhanced rates will remain 6 months beyond the ending of the declaration of the public health emergency. So ODP has been consistent in that. This is one-time funding that really ODP and the state have until 2024 to spend the money. So I think they have flexibility. I think that, for instance, when they asked us to spend recruitment and retention money by March of this year, 2022, I believe that in the eyes of the feds, it's really spent when ODP cuts the check because they're paying it out as fee for schedule or fee for service off the fee schedule. So they have some flexibility on timing. So I think it's possible that as those scenarios unfold and maybe there's a shortfall somewhere, that could be considered. So the state will have until 2024 to spend this ARPA money. But of course, their interest is really in these initiatives is to push it out now.
Okay. And we have another question out there. Has ODP discussed additional funds to support improved wages that will be needed if we train and empower our current workforce? How are they going to sustain these tiered wages through rates?
Mm-hmm. Well, currently they don't do that at all. So there is no sort of modifier or incentive to do this program. So to be very clear, if you were to adopt the eBadge program and set something up that you were paying staff at various levels based on how they advanced with eBadge Academy, there is no additional money that you can claim from ODP to fund those additional costs. That said, I do believe that Kristen and ODP would see this as a foundation to sort of look at what are providers willing to do, what would those increments look like, what would be those discrete points. But again, that's speculation, that's not appropriation. So there is no money tied to that in terms of DSP credentialing programs. I think that is a vision of ODP, that they would like to see that happen. I think they would be supportive to it if they had the money to budget toward those outcomes and to that process of accomplishing that. But right now, to be clear, this is not an initiative that if you adopted, that there would be any money to back up the wage side of it. In terms of what is ODP doing, I'll just revert back to our own advocacy at TPA around trying to get additional funding into the fee schedule rates. Again, what we heard from members very early on in the ARPA process was money into fee schedule rates was where membership wanted to see funds be invested, not in one-time payments. So I think that with our colleagues, we've been successful that there are increases to fee schedule rates. We happen to believe they are not sufficient. So we have continued to advocate for, as many of you may know, an additional $65 million specifically for fee schedule rates for DSPs, that being state funds, to be matched with another $71 million in federal money, which would bridge the gap between the $405 million that are in the fee schedule rates as proposed in the budget and the $541 million that we have been advocating for since the beginning of the ARPA proposal. So we continue to ask for those funds. And given what we all know about inflation, since we adopted that program, keeping pace with inflation is really a key element as well. So the global picture really involves gaining some equity with the market, which includes what the state pays state center workers, which is 30% higher than what community DSPs earn, and also with the market in general, and making sure that rates are market-based so that all of you can attract and retain workers in the marketplace. But tied to these initiatives or tied to incremental pay within the fee schedule rates, there is not currently anything at this time that is committed.
Okay. And just a quick note for all members, we finally were able to get the poll fixed, so it is up for you to respond to. Patrick, we do have another question here. Do you know either through TPA or any other organizations out there through ODP that are available to provide organizations technical assistance in applying for these funds?
Well, we have said as part of this workshop and sort of the planning that went into bringing out NADSP that and again, in the context of seeing how many organizations did not apply for prior initiatives, we're willing to do that for members and providers. So I will make that offer here again in terms of if you need technical assistance. I don't know to what capacity we can commit that. So we'd like to start by just making the offer. If we can connect or need to connect you with resources to do that. Again, as you can see, it is not a difficult or complicated application process. and you fill out the 2-page form and send Rick Smith an email. To the extent you need help doing that, or need help determining, or have questions about how much can or should you ask for, to the extent that you have questions about, if I go with NADSP, how can I estimate what the cost will be? We know they are in the wings, willing to sit down and have conversations with us. So I think it could happen either individually, if you want to reach out to either one of us. And Craig, if you can please just post our email addresses in the chat. Drop us a note if you have an interest specifically in technical assistance, and we can do it individually, and we could also possibly do a session just for those members that have a particular question about the application itself, or however things evolve based on your feedback today from your reaction to the poll or individual questions we have. But that is really our emphasis, is to make sure that every one of you on this webinar apply for the funds, because we believe everybody has a training need. Even if you do not go so far as to implement something around a credentialing program, take a look at the parameters of the program and see if perhaps you're not using one of the online training methods or modules. It's something that you can build, even if it's for the 15-month period. Give yourselves an opportunity to pilot something that at least during that time period would benefit you. Because again, this is money that's allocated for ODP to spend out. So first and foremost, we're encouraging everybody to apply for the funds. And if there is anything we can do to help you accomplish that, we want to try to do that.
Okay, thanks. And I did post the email address in there for anybody if you want to reach out to information@provideralliance.org. We can certainly try to connect you or help you out with any support you might need. We have a number of questions out there about more details on what the business associate component of this funding is. And I know that that's pretty much a mystery right now with ODP as well. So if you have any thoughts or clarification you might want to add, that might be helpful.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask anybody on this call if you have any experience in developing anything like that. The guidance is pretty vague. What's out there, just generally speaking, in terms of those types of programs, is not very detailed either. So what I can tell you is it would be an initiative, by my understanding, to embed somebody into industry or into a business that would help generate employment for that industry or business. So this is not something that would be similar to a credentialing program or even a training program. Here, I think it would be probably more wide open to whatever innovation you wanted to introduce. Again, there are some templates and these programs do exist. I'm not well prepared to tell you much more about them than what I already have. So if there's anybody on the call that has more information, more background, more experience, we certainly want to make sure you're aware of that, because we know, not just because we are an employment first state and that's highly prioritized by ODP, but that many of you do employment as a priority. So if anybody has feedback on that, I'd welcome the opportunity for you to help us out and provide that here with us today.
Okay, Patrick, we have another question here that's generally about, are there limits to what the funding can be used through for NADSP? In other words, do they have to be used just for eBadge, or can they be used for membership or other trainings?
I think the general rule is really, if you are adopting something new and incurring some additional expense to implement your stated initiative, I think that that is all fair game. I would defer to the folks at NADSP or wherever else you might be considering in terms of implementation costs, training costs, onboarding expenses of any sort. I think what ODP will not probably approve are anything that you're already paying for or something that you're already eligible to get through fee schedule. But I think that broadly speaking, again, because I believe ODP will welcome these applications, I think as long as you complete them thoroughly and you document even your questions within the application, lay out your framework, ask the question specifically if you need to. If we can answer it for you in advance, we'll certainly try to do so. But I think that you can just look at it from a perspective of additional new cost related to your initiatives. And again, would recommend that you just document, even if there's a question or a gray area in your mind. Given the dollar amount you may be asking for, it may not be material in the scope of how much you would ask for. You may need to ask for that much, whether or not there's a yes or no answer to a particular question on a line item. But again, I would encourage everybody, because of the simplicity of the form and the deadline that is fast approaching, if you have thoughts, to maybe just put those to paper and figure out what you can request, and then look at how you could build a budget to implement some of the things where you could identify the outcomes that you would hope to accomplish.
And we do have a question from Maria, and I'll just read this from the Q&A. My ideal thought would be to employ a person with the specific duty of onboarding and interviews, and a person to employ to keep up with the wait list with regard to compliance and monitoring home and community-based service goals and outcomes. And her question is this money, is that since this money will be only one time, how is it sustainable with growth?
Yeah, I think that's a great point in that question. And the reason why I would suspect anybody is going to be reluctant to, for instance, hire staffing around that, such as that example would imply. So I think that you have to see it as what it's called and what it is. It's one-time money. So to the extent you're able to pilot something, I think, again, working with other organizations may be a way of creating enough scope or scale that you can kind of learn more with a more limited investment, or taking your investment combined with others. I don't think there's a good answer to the question of how you can sustain this. If you put something in place and you do eBadge Academy as a for instance, and you love it, 15 months from now, I think you have to weigh, do the benefits outweigh the costs of the investment in the program? So if you're seeing improvement in quality outcomes, and you're seeing lower turnover, and you're seeing things that you can measure after 15 months, then maybe you say, we're willing to continue that because we see the offsets, and maybe it's even to your financial advantage. But to be very clear going into it, there is not going to be any commitment. I think to Bill's earlier point in question, I could see ODP, once everything shakes out, allocating a few more dollars on the back end of some of these initiatives if they were successful, because ODP will be in that same position at that time to look at what has worked and what they may want to invest further in down the road. But I think you'd have to be very careful about the level of commitment you want to make to recurring costs as you think about this. And something that is more portable, more variable, that is going to be the safest, most conservative way to go financially.
Okay, we have a number of questions out there about sort of, again, the scope of funding and whether this funding has to, we know, for example, from ODP, there's been a lot of discussion about, creating a DSP 1, 2, and 3, sort of a tiered system. So do we know if this funding can be used for frontline supervisors? Can it be used for staff to take very specific trainings? Any thoughts on again, the scope of what staff are ideal for this?
Well, I would probably stay true to what's documented and break it down that this is training, credentialing business associates for employment programs. So I think in terms of investment in any staffing, relating it to a 1, 2, 3 or frontline supervisor compensation plan, I would think that you would be on your own there, although I don't want to definitively state that. I think it has to be around the training and the credentialing aspects of that, and not the compensation levels. So, which gets back to the earlier question, you probably don't want to do that. It's like taking one-time money and issuing salary versus bonuses. So unless you were looking at one-time incremental bonuses, again, ODP has been very clear. If you look at ARPA more broadly, they wanted to look at recruitment and retention, they wanted to look at wages separately, and then they wanted to look at issues such as training and credentialing. So I think anything that runs in the direction of compensation or additional compensation to DSPs or frontline supervisors is going to be considered out of bounds for this money. I think what they are looking for are innovative approaches to develop credentialing programs that could create and define those tiers that might someday be a DSP 1, 2, and 3. So where you invest, if you decide you want to invest in frontline supervisor training, I know this is something that NADSP does, for instance. So there are already tiers established in their formula. That is probably true elsewhere, although I don't know for sure or have details on that. But I would stay more narrowly focused on training and credentialing, and then to the extent, as we've talked, exactly what a business associate program for employment might look like, again, which is different in terms of something that is more embedded in a particular employer.
Okay, and Karen asked a question just for clarity on collaboration. So each agency needs to apply individually for these funds, but she's asking if when we talk about collaborating in a way that providers are doing similar or parallel things for the sake of continuity and shared vision, is that okay? Is that an acceptable way to come together for the to pool these funds?
Yeah, I love those terms, continuity and shared vision. I would say that that is exactly what I would hope we could accomplish. I don't know, and I haven't heard of any reason why ODP would have any opposition to that. And that is sort of a step two that I think is based upon everybody's interest in adopting a common platform. So once you've done that, and for that continuity and shared vision and the ability to put something together that is common to other organizations, which also then can really help with portability of staff, keeping people in the system, promoting DSP as a career. So I think there are a lot of opportunities that have greater advantage by working together. But I think we first have to see where everybody lands on what they want to do. And the first step there is, again, getting everyone to really apply for the initiative money. I think that based on the poll, and maybe Craig, you can cover that. I mean, it looks like we have a pretty high majority of folks that are interested in the eBadge Academy, and a similar, maybe higher majority that are interested in collaborating with other TPA members. So I'm looking at 84% of people who voted say they would be interested in collaborating. So that being the case, having that information, I would expect we would do some sort of follow-up, and we would start to try to work with you. And maybe, as I mentioned earlier, if you're not someone on this call who typically is involved in the HR work group, that would be an opportunity to maybe have that type of project be managed and worked through our HR work group. Wouldn't have to be. I think that's up to those folks and what they want to do as well, of course. But I would think it would align very well and would be a very good TPA initiative. So that is kind of how I have been looking at it. Is there an opportunity to collaborate and to make the most of this money and make it more beneficial to you than it might be if you were just doing it on your own? I think the shared information and collaboration and building a community out of it would be a great project for us to undertake as TPA.
Okay. I think that's everything right now. We did have another question about whether or not the funding can be used to purchase equipment like iPads. And I think the answer, just to sort of reiterate, is, as long as it's tied to an overall proposal for how that would benefit training and credentialing, that again, this funding can be used for in a number of different creative ways.
Yep, agreed, Craig. And I also remind everyone, we did this workshop first on May 27th. We actually asked about interest in workshops for both training, credentialing, business associate programs, and the technology initiative. The technology initiative deadline is not until October, so we definitely wanted to move forward quickly with having this workshop. But we will likely schedule another one on tech. Now, the tech does not have nearly the amount of available funding. It's limited to $20,000 per provider organization, but that is another place you can consider if you're thinking about any type of technology and an iPad or a tablet or something similar. Again, here, I think if it's lined up with credentialing and training programs, as Craig said, I think it's absolutely within the scope. But you may also have another opportunity through technology initiative money to apply for something there as well. So you may want to think about applying even now, because they're accepting applications for tech, even though the deadline is until October. That program is also open. So if you have some tech money or some tech initiatives or hardware and equipment in mind, you could consider putting it over onto that application.
I think that covers us with the questions that have come in. Anybody else having any other comments or questions, please submit through the chat or put in the Q&A, or you can also raise your hand.
Okay, if nothing else is in, Craig, I am glad to give back 10 minutes to everybody to go work on their applications. So please contact us if you have any questions at all. We will go through the poll results. I think you can expect at a minimum, if you are on this webinar, we'll follow up with you in terms of application, and if you are wanting to pursue NADSP. If you need our help being connected with the folks at NADSP, again, we put their whole proposal, presentation, contact information. So you're welcome to reach out to them directly. If you need help, let us know. If you need help with your application, determining anything about available funding, questions about scope, eligibility, we're happy to help reach out to ODP to get clarifications that are needed too as they arise. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Have a great day. And again, please contact us if you have any further questions.